My first engagement manager told me that if you don't go to work with the tiny little knot in your stomach, that kind of signals that you're ready to level up. You can have the best idea in the world, but you got to get people to listen to you.
Johan Hoernell, CEO and co-founder of Reveal Automation, scaled time edit to a successful exit and honed his strategic expertise at McKinsey.
And no good plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. What I think we'd kind of forgotten a little bit was how incredibly important it is to have some of those key players in place to help execute on the plan.
So how are you sharing those financial metrics, whether KPIs or financials with the team, and how do they use that to make decisions?
The main kind of piece that we tried to instill across the organization was that we wanted to run this based on context and not based on control. And we tried to tell everyone in a leadership position that your job is to provide context. Because ultimately, if you didn't do that, then we as humans often confuse big decisions for difficult decisions, and I don't think they're necessarily always the same.
What is one common financial pitfall that startups should avoid?
I wouldn't say fail fast. You shouldn't necessarily focus so much on the failure aspect of it, but...
Welcome to 5 to 50, Financial Strategies for Growing Companies, the podcast that gives business owners and entrepreneurs the tools to scale with confidence. I'm your host, Jeff Rudner. In every episode, we unpack proven strategies that optimize finances, improve cash flow, and leverage technology that all drive growth. So whether you're a founder, a CEO, or an advisor supporting businesses, you'll hear from proven experts and leaders sharing experiences and insights that you can use to help your company thrive. Let's build smarter, scale faster, and take our business to the next level.
Welcome to today's episode of 5 to 50. Thrilled to introduce Johan Hoernell, CEO and co-founder of Reveal Automation, an enablement platform designed to unlock the full value of enterprise digital tools by automating content creation. Before founding Reveal, Johan scaled time edit to a successful exit and honed his strategic expertise at McKinsey. Johan's an expert in helping companies optimize their operations through technology and automation. And today we're going to dive into Johan's entrepreneurial journey, exploring the strategies that drive his business and the lessons he learned along the way. Johan, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So did you always have the entrepreneurial bug, or was it fostered at McKinsey?
That's a good question. I think I kind of always did. From when I was very young, I always kind of liked building things. Had this little kind of young electrician kit that I was gifted, one Christmas, and we were inseparable. Just like playing with stupid things, kind of seeing what happened if I did this or did that. And as I got older, I got into programming and kind of realized that I wasn't born with the best dexterity necessarily. So anything that kind of involved my hands, that was always never going to really be my thing, no matter how much I liked it. Mm-hmm. And then I discovered, computers and realized that, well, all I got to do here is actually type. Mm-hmm. And that will allow me to build stuff and build products and actually get stuff out there. And that opened up a whole new world for me. So I started doing that when I was, 12 or something. And, initially just building stupid websites, etc. But kind of kept that up through college. Figured coming out of college that, at the end of the day, maybe before I jump into actually building something myself, it'd be good if I knew something about what running a business is like and what the actual corporate world looks like. And it was kind of on the basis of that I decided to, join McKinsey. And McKinsey is an incredibly entrepreneurial firm and company. And so while I definitely had the bug going in there, I think it was something that only grew stronger at McKinsey.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's stay at McKinsey a little bit in your journey. What were your responsibilities there, and how did your experiences and learnings at McKinsey help you execute later on?
Very good question. It's difficult to condense. I was only there for 3 years, but it's a relatively intense work environment. You go through a lot of things. And I remember one of the first things I remember incredibly vividly was my first engagement manager, my first study told me that, if you don't go to work with the tiny little knot in your stomach, that, or if you don't have it, that kind of signals that you're ready to level up. And that was, an interesting insight, and something that I think led me to try to start to hone in on what type of change you can drive if you are willing to put yourself out there and be a little uncomfortable. And also that, there's definitely a rule book. There's definitely things that you should follow. And there's, it's not a free for all by any means, but that ambition and just taking initiative is something that's rewarded, generally speaking. I started out in McKinsey as a business analyst, just like, everybody else. And I think on this particular first study, my main responsibility was page trackers. So, not adding a ton of value, but it's, just getting into the grind, understanding what things are and how to do things. Over time, what I spent the majority of my time doing there was in the telco and TMT space, working on kind of different types of growth cases, different types of, cost projects, different type of strategy cases, which I think gave me a really good understanding of the holistic nature of what it takes to run a business.
Yep.
And what are the levers you can use to start shaping your unit economics? And what it takes to, okay, so if we want to grow, if we want to increase our growth by X, what does that take in terms of adding costs to our P&L or to our balance sheet, whatever it is.
Right.
And try to kind of figure out how do you grow as not necessarily quickly as possible, but as whichever way you want to grow in as optimized of a way as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now I started my career at Deloitte, and when I think back on it, the learnings weren't so much the numbers.
No.
It was learning how to learn and how to work and how to apply learnings in the most efficient way possible.
Exactly.
But really getting through the grind to understand how to learn as quickly as possible, how to work hard. Because there are plenty of late nights there, I'm sure, for you. Night. And does that apply? I'm sure it applies to this day, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a much better and much more succinct way of saying what I was trying to get out. I think on top of that, I would also emphasize the kind of the interpersonal relationships and understanding the importance of them. That you can have the best idea in the world, but you got to get people to listen to you.
You got to get buy-in.
Exactly, you got to get buy-in, and you can only be so much of a bull in a china shop. Mm-hmm. This I think is incredibly applicable throughout literally everything. Maybe more so in a consulting role when you're coming from the outside and trying to convince people who may or may not actually have signed off on procuring your services. You got to be delicate, and you've got to be a good listener, because at the end of the day, they know their business, you don't.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. We'll talk about change management in a minute, but I'm sure you have plenty of stories being probably 25-year-old, still a kid, working with experienced professionals and having to command a room and getting them to buy into the strategy you're proposing.
Yeah. And I'm 35 now. I still got the baby face. It wasn't any better back then.
Do you have a story that sticks in your mind about pitching an idea or a strategy to a client that you really thought you were going to have trouble winning the room, but in the end of the day, something stood out that got you to across the goal line?
Maybe not a particular story per se, but I'd say, generally speaking, the most successful way I was able to do it was to have the client pitch it. So kind of, setting the stage before you even get in there. If this is something that's, if I'm pitching it, I'm 25, I've done this, I've been on this particular study for, I don't know, a month, 2 months, I fully both understand and respect if people don't take me particularly seriously. And you got to play the cards you're dealt. And in this case, the card that I could play was just getting alignment and buy-in prior to that meeting with somebody who I knew the rest of the room would listen to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Figuring out who that leader is, or who that keystone in the room is that holds everyone together. Cool. So how did you parlay your experience at McKinsey into the next opportunity at TimeEdit?
Well, I think there were both a lot of good that I was able to extrapolate and kind of leverage at TimeEdit, but I think there were also definitely a few things that I had to relearn. And I think, just like you said, some of the things that were incredibly helpful were, the kind of the learning, having learned how to learn. So how to, quickly get into a new situation, try to get a sense of what matters, not to be, crude, but who matters, and get some sort of baseline understanding of what's going on and what our inputs, our outputs, and what's kind of good, what's maybe not.
Makes sense.
Not as good.
So you're at McKinsey, and how did you know it was time to leave? Were you presented an opportunity? Were you searching for one?
No, I stumbled upon one. I was really loving McKinsey, to be honest. I'd been able to do a lot of the things that I, at least at that point in time, loved doing. I was always traveling, and that was still fun and relatively new, and got to experience a lot of new countries and a lot of new cultures, work with amazing people, work on things that I thought were really interesting. So I had no real intention of leaving, but I had a good friend of mine who had met at McKinsey as well. He had taken the role as CEO of TimeEdit, and he came to me and he said, I think we got a pretty good case here. Here's kind of my idea for what we should do with this company. What do you think?
And what was that thesis?
Well, the thesis was essentially that it was a company that had been doing well, very well, was, founded back in the early 90s and had grown into a stable and dominant position as a scheduling provider for higher education in the Nordics. What the thesis was that there's a lot more that you can provide outside of just scheduling to kind of the same group of buyers that would provide step change in the value delivered to each and every university. If you have to have all these kind of point solutions that integrate relatively poorly, a lot of the value gets lost in the translation between all of these tools. And if you could actually expand from just doing scheduling to doing more of academic operations, 1 + 1 wouldn't just be 2, it would be 4. And on top of that, there was also a big, market play or geography play, where TimeEdit was more or less only a Nordic company, but the same type of problem is faced by universities globally. So that was, it's not a rocket science thesis by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that the evidence that TimeEdit was well positioned to capitalize on the opportunity, I think, was something that the CEO, another Johan, was able to articulate in an incredibly attractive way.
And so you're presented this idea. How much diligence did you do, and how much time from when you're presented the opportunity to making that decision did you take?
4 months, 5 months. Otherwise I have this saying that we as humans often confuse big decisions for difficult decisions. And I don't think they're necessarily always the same. It's a big decision to move somewhere, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a difficult decision. Just to name a maybe silly example. But in this case, maybe for the first time in my life, actually took a bit of time. So Johan and I spent the better part of all weekends, the fall of 2017, just kind of diving deeper into this business and the market in general, and trying to understand what it would take to actually make this thesis come to life. And what would the products be that we would have to build? What would the markets be that we would enter? What would the team look like? What would the amount of capital we would need? What would that look like? And kind of see if we can get all these pieces to fit together.
Awesome. And you spend all this time up front trying to paint a picture of what it's going to be like should you decide to join. You decide to join. How big of a delta was there between what you thought you were entering to the business that you entered? Because undoubtedly, the picture that's painted from an outsider perspective in your mind as you're going through this, when you think about the opportunity, is a lot different than when you're the one that's responsible for executing.
I don't think the delta in terms of the things we'd covered was actually that big. I think we'd done a good analysis of the business, of the market in general. I think we made a couple of incorrect assumptions around the pace at which you could actually win new contracts in other countries. But I mean, we weren't massively off on that either. I think the thing that I, in hindsight, have come to realize is that, the plan, another silly saying, right? So the plan, no good plan ever survives first contact with the enemy, whatever it is, but like something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
And in this case, what I think we'd kind of forgotten a little bit was how incredibly important it is to have some of those kind of key players in place to help execute on the plan. So I think the plan in and of itself was relatively sound. I don't think the delta was insane, but I do think that we'd maybe forgotten that we need a little bit more expertise, a couple of other players that could come in and really help drive this change. Again, at this point, I wasn't 25, but I was 28. So,
Yep.
naive, blue-eyed, just, ready to take on and conquer the world. If, I'm happy to run into a wall as many times as I have to.
Yep.
Sometimes it's actually easier to, walk around the wall instead of going through it.
Yeah. But my favorite quote of the same saying is everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
I think that was Mike Tyson. Said that one. So you're operating the business. What role did the finance team play? How early did you have a finance team, and what was their interaction and their role in supporting the initial success and then overall?
We started out with just a bookkeeper on the team, which was, incredibly it was essential. There were a lot of people with a finance background on the team. Yep. So, in theory, we should be able to do this, but, it doesn't make our beer taste any better, and we're not actually that good at it.
Yeah.
So that was critical just to be able to run the day-to-day operations, and making sure that we stayed compliant and all of those things. This time it is a Swedish company, so the reporting side of things is perhaps a little bit easier than what it is in the States.
In what way?
Well, the tax filings make sense. They don't necessarily require you to hire attorneys to file them. Even you got to do your books, and that's not something I'd recommend you do by yourself.
Yep.
But once that part's done, the rest is actually relatively trivial and relatively, digitized in the sense that you can just copy paste some numbers and then you're good to go. It's more like the Delaware franchise tax filings than the actual IRS filing. Right.
Makes sense. Is there as much complexity to the tax code as there is in the States? Because in the States, it can be pretty straightforward depending on your situation, but the more complex your tax situation, if you own businesses or if you have multiple investments in different vehicles, it can be a lot of compliance requirements, but it also can open up opportunities. Is that the same?
Well, I'd say I think you summarized it really well. The Swedish tax code in general is simpler, which also opens up fewer opportunities.
Yep.
It's more kind of streamlined for an average person.
Yep.
Which means that you get, no matter really how many businesses you own, you'll get a pre-printed or pre-populated form sent to you by the tax agency. you'll probably, if you own businesses, you're probably going to have to add a couple of amendments to it. But they're, again, relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is there's probably not as many optimizations that you can make.
Makes sense. Yeah, we work with our clients frequently, touching base quarterly to understand the business, seeing what opportunities might be ahead of them, or understand what kind of changes in their tax structure and planning we need to make, because the tax code is fairly complex.
Yeah. It's also, 320 million people to 10.5 million people.
Right, exactly. So going back to the time edit and the initial days, it sounds like you had a bookkeeper, but finance was kind of finance by committee. You had experts, or you had experienced leaders that knew how to read financial statements. They knew what metrics to track. What part of the business were you responsible for?
So I was the chief product and chief technology officer. That said, the business was relatively small when I got in there, so it was a little bit all hands on deck. I remember sitting with the other Johan, and we built the first model. We tried to automate as much as possible. How can we get the statements from our bookkeeping software to flow into a Google Sheet, mm-hmm. then with the most convoluted, index match formula, get the right line items, aggregate them, put them straight into the model, yep. Add back whatever things we actually don't care about in our model, convert from one type of recurring revenue to another, change the revenue recognition, all of those things.
Yep.
Kind of get the KPIs that we, were actually interested in tracking. Mm-hmm. So we spent a decent amount of time on that. And I think we got to a place that was helpful and did what we wanted it to do at the time, but kind of at the downside of that was we definitely, we sunk a lot of hours into this.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't particularly maintainable. It definitely could have been done much better with dedicated people and dedicated software.
Yeah, makes sense. Now you can do that with streamlined software that integrates with your accounting system. You build your model and it kind of reforecasts quickly. We use it with some of our clients, and it's unfortunate that the software wasn't available previously. But
I don't know if we care to look even. It's like if you can run into the wall, let's run into the wall. Let's kind of
yeah. So I had a call earlier this week with a company called Clockwork that integrates with your QuickBooks system. There's others, Giraffe, or if you want to get it outside of their software, you can use LiveFlow to integrate. That integrates into to Google Sheets, and you can build your model there. So these are fairly recent developments over the past few years, but it used to take a lot of work.
Yeah, that's a game changer, honestly, because it's so critical to have that, to be able to understand the types of investments you can make, or what the repercussions would be of a certain investment, and then also to be able to follow up on it and get all the forecasting, the budgeting, get that down into the teams as quickly as possible without you don't want to be the bottleneck. You want to make sure the teams can actually do their work.
Right.
So
how are you sharing those those metrics, whether KPIs or financials, with the team, and how did they use that to make decisions?
Well, we used a lot of there was this dashboard software back in the day, maybe it's still around, called Gecko Board, that we used to kind of highlight all of the KPIs that we were, interested in tracking. We, had department specific KPIs, etc. We bought, I don't know how many TVs just to get them up around the office, so people wouldn't have to, go to log on to a specific website and check them. We wanted to make sure it was top of mind with everybody, and we wanted to make sure that it was transparent. We didn't want to silo it and say the customer success metrics are only visible for customer success and the engineering metrics only for engineering, whatever. We wanted that the whole kind of thesis upon which we try to build Time Edit was that everyone's, I don't really like the term everyone's an owner, but everyone's an incredibly important piece of this puzzle, and everyone deserves to know what's going on.
That's impressive. That's different from many of the other entrepreneurs that we talk to, where they have their department heads focus on specific KPIs solely for their departments. So you were having everybody focus on the same KPIs.
At least everybody knowing all of the KPIs.
Yeah.
I mean,
knowing what move the business forward.
Exactly. And I think it's, we had this, the main kind of piece that we tried to instill across the organization was that we wanted to run this based on context and not based on control. And we try to tell everyone in a leadership position that your job is to provide context to, the ICs, to the people who are actually doing the work. Mm-hmm. And if they're making a decision that you don't agree with, the first thing to ask yourself is whether you actually provided them with the right context. The second question, because ultimately, if you didn't do that, then, you should probably look at yourself for kind of the root cause analysis. And if you did provide the right context and they made the wrong decision, then it's maybe a question of whether it was the right hire or not. But it's difficult to provide context. I think it's an underestimated art form. But I also think what we really saw at time at it was that when you were able to kind of empower everybody and everybody felt like they understood what was going on holistically, from a line of code being written to a user at a university using it to a salesperson pitching it, it just gave people a much greater sense of accomplishment and a much greater sense of involvement and ownership.
Yeah,
which was huge for us.
That's awesome. So you have these TVs around the office. Everyone's understands what leadership thinks needs, what metrics leadership's tracking to move the company forward. How did you aggregate that information? You had one bookkeeper at the beginning. How did that finance team evolve over time?
Well, we eventually hired a CFO, and a dedicated, albeit outsourced, but still dedicated bookkeeping service to help the CFO. That was also huge. That was a step change in terms of our ability to actually get accurate real-time data on what was going on and how things were, progressing, how, customers were. I mean, even just like the simplest things such as, tracking invoices and ensuring that things didn't fall between the chairs.
Right.
So it was a game changer, both in terms of on the strategic side, but also tactically. Mm-hmm. And so that was in, I want to say 2020, maybe 2021 when we hired the CFO. That was huge.
And was the CFO responsible for financial and operational data?
Maybe the aggregation of it, but the operational data was sourced from the teams.
Right. But the CFO had visibility, aggregating it into reporting for leadership, for the operations team, but getting everything in one place.
Exactly.
And were there systems or their processes that worked in order to do that? Aggregating data from multiple departments sometimes can be like herding cats. Did you see anything that worked for you guys or for your CFO that helped with that process?
Well, I think what worked was going back out into the teams and asking them what was relevant for them to share, and also kind of the other side of that, what would they want to, ideally, if they got to choose, what would they want to see from the other teams? So again, kind of just like to avoid that whole herding cats issue, let's make sure that these requests come from your fellow coworkers and not from management. So if you can go to CS and say, well, engineering is actually really interested in this metric, it's going to be a lot easier to get them to actually put the data together, submit it on time, whatever the process actually is.
Yeah. As
opposed to if it's just something that comes from management and they feel disconnected to it.
Yeah, it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning, getting that buy-in, helping people understand why they're doing something and getting them bought into the reason behind it and helping them subscribe to that thesis. Amazing. So you've operated time at it, you're scaling. How did you know when it was the right time to exit?
We started looking for kind of an institutional investor almost from day one, with the thought being that this is probably going to take a while. We're new to this game, so there are a couple of things we need to figure out, and we were willing to kind of hear them tell us no, as long as they also tell us why they're saying no, so we can work on, over the next years fixing that, so that, a couple of years down the road, they'll say yes. So we met with a bunch of investors already in 2018, we started almost immediately after I joined, and which was incredibly helpful to get a sense of what are the questions they're asking, almost why are they asking them, and what are they looking for us to be, an attractive target. And obviously at that point there was a big discrepancy in valuation, because we had all these plans and that we really believed in, but we, at that point we hadn't materialized any of that. So we felt that, we wanted to prove that X dollars in equals Y dollars out, just to make sure that, the level or the degree of, asymmetric information goes down, and which, if we do that, then the discrepancy in valuation will also probably go down.
Yeah, makes sense. And so you found a buyer, and with most transactions, I'm assuming you had to go through some diligence. What was the diligence process like?
Well, so one of the things we really liked with the buyer was that they were incredible. They were straight shooters. We'd actually engaged both the other Johan and myself had played soccer with one of the guys, at the PE firm that ended up buying us. We'd never talked about work ever. I don't think we even, at least not in the beginning, knew where he was working, what he was doing. We just, had a good time every Friday morning, 7 a.m. We played soccer together. And got a great sense of who he was as a person, and, the fact that, he stood by his word. What he said was something, he communicated with honesty, and we felt confident that they would actually, because, you're kind of giving away control of your baby. And there's a lot of things that can be said prior to that final, acquisition letter being signed or term sheet being signed. But as soon as you've relinquished control of a majority of the shares, it doesn't really matter what they said.
Right.
So we selected this buyer. Obviously, valuation is important. We selected them primarily because of the fact that we've really enjoyed everyone we met with. Were just phenomenal human beings. And the diligence was interesting. So this was fall of 2020. So it was peak COVID. Europe in general was a little behind the US in terms of rolling out the vaccines. So it was still, that said, it was also maybe wasn't as locked down to begin with. At least Sweden wasn't. But it was, we'd very quickly gone from, everything's in person, especially stuff like this, to let's do as much as humanly possible over Zoom. And let's, what that means, all buying enterprise licenses for Zoom, figuring out, what's my AV setup in this conference room that we've only ever used for in-person stuff.
Yeah.
But they told us it would be a relatively light diligence process. We'd be able to do it over a couple of weeks, maybe a month. Mm-hmm. I'd say they lived up to all of that.
Yeah.
There was a financial diligence. There was a legal diligence. There was a, engineering product technical diligence. There was a team diligence. They kind of, separated them all out into tracks, had separate people running them, brought in experts where they needed. And it was smooth. I mean, It was a lot of work, but there were no surprises.
That's the way it should work, right? It sounds like you were prepared for it. You had your financial hygiene was in place. Your your documents were in order.
Yep.
There isn't much to hide. You weren't trying to pull a fast one over the buyer. Sounds like you were doing everything on the up and up, and your buyers, had confidence from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think it helped. We didn't have a data room going into it, but we essentially had all the pieces for the data room.
Yep.
And I think that was helpful that, I wouldn't say we were a mature company per se, but we had a level of maturity to our reporting that was helpful for the diligence process.
Awesome. So now let's talk about your current venture, Reveal Automation. What led you to start this company?
So one of the key things that I saw both at McKinsey, honestly, and at TimeEdit was how, you go out and you build these great pieces of software, and then you sell them and you try to implement them. Emphasis on try to implement them. And you're left with, unfortunately, a lot of people who either aren't available for training or don't spend enough time in the software for very legitimate reasons to really leverage the full value of the software that they've bought, which leads to unhappy buyers, leads to lost upsales, lost growth, all of these things that could be potentially solved if there was a better way to do enablement and a better way to do change management. One can certainly do enablement and change management manually, but it's a very costly endeavor. There's a lot of bodies that need to be thrown at the problem. Think everything from, actual training sessions. So, you have a couple of people training users, down to writing product documentation, which, as soon as you've written it, it's out of date. And the most unfortunate piece to this puzzle is that while it's an absolute game changer to have, product documentation that's actually up to date, it is detrimental to have outdated product documentation. It's better to not have it at all than to have outdated product documentation. So you're left with this choice of whether you want to try to actually create documentation that's up to date, in which case you're very likely to do much better, or skip doing that, because if you can't keep it up to date, you're probably going to do worse.
Right.
And at TimeEdit, we solved this problem relatively manually, but it kind of worked because the ticket size was relatively large. Selling enterprise to universities, it's a decent ticket size, but that's not the reality for the majority of SaaS companies or software companies out there.
Right.
So Reveal was founded on the principle that we have, my co-founder Phil and myself, we have cracked this problem. We have been able to successfully do really good enablement manually. We know how to do it. Now let's productize that and let's make it a repeatable, scalable, and automated process.
You went from scaling and successfully exiting a company that was decent size, had a lot of history behind it, to now effectively bootstrapping between you and your co-founder.
Yep.
What have been the initial challenges going from a large company to a small team?
Well, I'll just keep going with the kind of military metaphors here, but I love trench warfare.
Okay.
It is my absolute favorite type of business building.
Yeah.
I getting my hands dirty, I think, is fantastic. Actually being in constant contact with people that use the software that we've built is, the reason I get up in the morning. Not necessarily my family is the reason I get up in the morning, but the reason I go to work. It's the thing that it gives me the most energy.
Yeah.
And so I absolutely love this phase of building a business.
Yeah.
Of course, it was a lot easier to get a lot more done when you had, at TimeEdit. I would say, the main reason I left at the end of the day was because I'd worked myself out of a job. we had hired people who were much better at what they were doing than I am. And that, in a way, that was humbling, a little sad, but also incredibly fulfilling to see. it was kind of like the baby grew up,
Yeah.
But it was also a lot easier, for a period of time at Time-Edit to, just get more bandwidth. So I think that's the biggest challenge that I feel like we're facing right now. There's so many things, there's so many opportunities we want to capitalize on.
Yep.
But it's just the two of us, and intentionally it's just the two of us. But that means we got to stay laser focused, and we have to scrutinize everything we do to see if it's actually worthwhile.
Right.
And I like kind of a full frontal attack, doing as much as humanly possible, but it's not necessarily the best way of actually conducting business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right now you're the head of sales, the CFO, the marketing officer, the head of development. You're wearing all the hats.
It's a very thick stack of hats.
Yeah.
But I got Phil, and Phil's, I couldn't have had a better co-founder either.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
He's carrying a lot
What
of
are the goals? What are the goals for Reveal?
The goals, we want to be able to build a product that enables any software company out there to automatically provide the world's best enablement to all of their users, so that they can immediately communicate the value of their product and have every single user use their product as if they'd already used it for 20 years without any level of engineering involvement, with minimal touch points from product or CS or whatever. We believe all of this can be automated today with the use of some smart AI, some smart LLMs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I personally feel very strongly that it's the current state of the world is relatively sad, where we have a lot of really, really good software out there, but there's this discrepancy between the buyers or some of the users on the buyer side thinking this is an absolute crap piece of software, and then you have the vendor who's they pour their heart into building this, and I think to a large extent that discrepancy is just a lack of enablement, and we want to be able to provide that bridge without increasing headcount or without taking on a massive capex investment.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I definitely recommend you should outsource your accounting and your CFO in order to do that. As speaking someone who sells these services, they can add a lot of value, and we've had that conversation offline. You're trying to attack some pretty lofty or achieve some pretty lofty goals. Shouldn't be the one doing the books. All right,
even without lofty goals, we shouldn't be the ones doing the books.
That's right. That's right. All right. So one more big lofty question before we go into a couple rapid fire. But what was the best decision you made in your career, looking back on it so far? Jumping
ship from McKinsey and joining Time-Edit, without a doubt.
Awesome. All right. So a few rapid fire questions to take us out. What is the best piece of financial advice you've ever received, or a financial quote you keep in mind that you want to share?
When in doubt, ask an expert.
Awesome. What is one common financial pitfall that startups should avoid?
Revenue recognition. Do it right from the beginning.
Awesome. What book or resource has significantly influenced your thinking about business and management?
The biggest inspiration for me hasn't been a book. Maybe you could call him a resource, but it would be Johan, the other Johan, the CEO of Time-Edit. He has a fantastic intuition for how to run a business, for how to get people on board, for tactics, for strategy, and for how to rally people around a common goal. I'm not certain he really knows himself how good he is at it.
Amazing. That's awesome. What's some quick advice you have for anyone that is looking to launch their first startup?
I mean, everybody says this, but just do it. It's a minefield, but you can navigate it. And the difference to real minefield is you get a second chance.
Yep.
So Just do it. Don't outsource your accounting, outsource the stuff that can get you into legal trouble. And then don't be afraid. Once you've done that and you've kind of secured your legal basis, don't be afraid to fail. I wouldn't necessarily say fail fast. I don't think you shouldn't necessarily focus so much on the failure aspect of it, but don't be afraid to do it, and don't let that be the reason you don't start a company.
Awesome. Where can people find you online if they're looking to learn more about you, Reveal Automation?
Yeah. So, happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn, obviously. Reveal, our website, you can find it on www.revealautomation.com.
Awesome. Johan, thank you so much for the time. Look forward to staying in touch and following the Reveal journey.
Likewise, thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thanks for tuning in to 5 to 50. If you found today's episode helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other business owners looking to grow. Do you have a question or a topic you'd like us to cover? Connect with us on LinkedIn or reach out to us at ProSeer, where we're empowering entrepreneurs with real-time, actionable insights and financial infrastructure through smarter accounting, tax, and financial strategies. Let's keep this conversation going. Together, we'll help our businesses thrive. Talk to you soon.